love to have everybody go on mute, as Robin talked about a little bit earlier. The Our firm has a national practice, and we've been involved in probably 250 miles of concept planning for bus rapid transit projects throughout Maryland, in Montgomery County, Howard County, Prince George's County, Anne Arundel County in particular. And it seems it was a few weeks, maybe a few months now ago, when I produced an op-ed article when government was reconsidering building the Red Line through downtown Baltimore. And I felt it was incumbent upon me to at least give a counterpoint opinion as to why possibly the Red Line might not be the right choice for the city of Baltimore and the state of Maryland at this point in time. There's no question that equity and good transportation or great transportation is important for the city, but there also needs to be an understanding that transportation systems need to be properly designed, properly funded, and that we are not wasting time and money with a transportation system that just makes us feel good and doesn't do what it needs to do. So I'm going to take about 10 or 15 minutes, go through a presentation that I put together with the anticipation that we are going to come away with some information that you can use going forward. And my screen has frozen. Let me see what is going on here. And obviously the problem with doing these types of presentation, changing our world, is that the technology does not always work. So you can see the first screen. There we go. I'm going to minimize this. Hopefully, put this out of the way. You know, today in the United States, and you can see the second screen, Robin.
What we're seeing at the moment is the emergence of BRT in the United States.
Terrific. Today, as it relates to BRT, there's about 13 different cities have implemented BRT corridors, many of which have been in place for many years. The good thing for communities around the country is that there are obviously dozens that are either under construction or being planned. But today, as we all know, U.S. cities really are grappling with complex challenges. You've got the climate crisis, you've got equity, you've got affordability, you've got the economy, and now you've got COVID, not to mention all of the challenges that we have throughout the United States with road fatalities. We actually have another crisis and an epidemic as it relates to roadway fatalities, dealing with bicycles and pedestrians and cars in general. And so there are tons of things that we as a country, as individual communities, are dealing with. And solving all of these things costs money. And I'm going to drill down on that in quite some time, in quite some detail in just a few minutes. High quality BRT corridors really are meant to provide faster and more reliable service. And as many of you know, reliability is vitally important. if you're going to attract ridership to any type of transit. And we know from experience that new riders are really often drawn to new BRT routes and corridors. And and because of that, and it's because it reduces bus delays that new riders, increased ridership is occurring, because you've got to be able to rely on the transportation system that you're using, whether it's a bus, whether it's a train, whether it's Uber or Lyft or any other type of transportation. The reliability is the reason why some riders either transfer and change their mode of transportation or stay with what they've got because they're very satisfied. But when you end up showing up at a bus stop and you think the bus is going to be there in moments or minutes, and you wait and you wait and you wait, most folks cannot afford to be late for their job. And so the reliability is vitally, vitally important for all modes of transportation. But it also offers different distinct advantages over rail. One is capital costs are dramatically lower than rail. And I'll talk about that. And planning and construction are really far less complex than trying to build a new light or heavy rail line. But bus ridership between 2020 and 2017 was down even pre-COVID. Baltimore was down almost 24%, Washington, D.C. Down 8%, and the 20 largest bus systems in the United States were down 12%. And that's pre-COVID. That's before we had the work from home phenomenon that continues to occur. You know, there are discussions all the time about, well, you know, you can't move as many people in a bus or a BRT as you can in light rail or heavy rail. That may be true in some circumstances, but this slide shows you that in Central America, when you've got high density, when the density is high enough in communities, you can move a dramatic number of people in a bus rapid transit system when you've got larger buses, 120 passenger buses, and they're running at very close headways. So the fact that you or some folks thinks that you cannot move as many people is really a fallacy, because it's being done every day in Central American cities. So the average weekday ridership on Baltimore's light rail, the one that runs from Anne Arundel County north up to Hunt Valley, in 2018 was 23,000 persons. And that's a 30-mile system with 33 stations, about one per mile. And that's really the distance that the major organizations in the world recommend for BRT, about a mile between stations. They operate 20 hours a day, which means that on the average, they're getting about 1,000 people an hour, 1,000 people an hour over a 30-mile system with 33 stations. That's really, quite frankly, pathetic. The only time that the Baltimore light rail line is heavily utilized is when there are sports events down at Camden Yards. For the most part, anyone who wants to be honest with themselves, looking at light rail trains that are passing you, you're lucky if you see a few people in each car. And so I'm pointing that out because I'm obviously not promoting the red line, and we need to look at what has happened with the other Baltimore light rail line, the one that runs north-south. And all of that relates back to density. And I say that because there are international acre requirements and personnel requirements that you need to have enough density in order to provide sufficient ridership. For subway, they're suggesting that you have about 45 persons per acre. For light rail, the suggestion is less than subway, but you still need to have about 30 persons per acre trying to serve with light. The city of Baltimore, which has about 59,000 acres, and the latest census shows that there's about 600,000 people, which means that you're only at about 10 persons per acre. So the city has a density that's about a third of what the industry says you need to do that. The cost to build is also a dramatic circumstance, and that is light rail is typically 150 to 250 million dollars a mile. The Purple Line, which is going to run east-west from Montgomery County to Prince George's County, is going to be $345 million a mile. So for 16 miles, they're going to spend $5.6 billion. I guarantee you the density is not there. The red line in Baltimore was projected at $205 million per mile. So for 14 miles, government wants to spend almost $3 billion. BRT, $20 to $50 million a mile. So the difference at the high end could be $150 million a mile between what the red line was projecting and what BRT could be. And you could put BRT in the same area as you're proposing, or as the red line is being proposed. And I say that because here's one of the best BRT systems that I found in North America. The cross section, it's up in Toronto, in the York region of Toronto, where you've got a 22-foot wide median area for the BRT buses, plus you've got where you've got stations, you've got an additional 13 feet. This happens to be a cross section of some work when I was looking at Montgomery County BRT systems. This very quickly, Argentina, and Las Vegas, where they have taken the median area of the main highway and had two-way BRT system with very long 120 passenger buses that, quite frankly, look like they could be a BRT car. Downtown Cleveland, one of the first and probably a very, very famous BRT line called the Health Line, that has been wildly successful both in ridership and in economic development that has come along behind the BRT line. Another early adopter of BRT is Eugene, Oregon, the Green Line, again, using level boarding, using long buses and off bus transit fares. This is a section of the Purple Line in Prince George's County. Let me go back to that a second. 31 feet is what they were, is this area in College Park, showing the total amount of space that's needed. The very first busway, Metroway, in Alexandria and Arlington, 26 feet wide. So we're in a circumstance where we do not need to have any more. We could have the same right-of-way that we were proposing for the red line and use it as BRT. if one day government decides, or there is a demand for light rail, you can go back and put in the tracks. There's no reason why that can't happen. So doing what I'm suggesting does not stop the red line from ever being built. But what it does do is potentially stop spending an extra $150 million a mile when we have so many other issues in the city where that money could be put to good use. And so overall, you've also got an operating cost issue. Operating cost of one light rail car is somewhere between 124 and 450 million, $450 per hour operating cost. A bus is about 85 to $164 operating cost of one bus per hour. So light rail, in addition to the construction cost, is somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 times more just to operate the system. And the question becomes, does government, does the state of Maryland, does the city of Baltimore have enough money to first build it and hope they will come, and then operate it on a long-term basis? My suggestion is that there may be a better way to provide equitable transportation. Build the system, build the basic infrastructure where it was going to be built, operated as a BRT system until such time as there's proof that there is enough density, enough passenger ridership to warrant building light rail and paying for it and then paying to operate it. So overall, I went back and looked at light rail vehicles based on the top 10 light rail systems in the United States. Overall, the trip length of a rider is 5.5 miles. The average number of people per vehicle, 25. These are the top 10 light rail systems in the United States. 25 people, yet the capacity of each vehicle was 184. So their average occupancy of a car on the top 10 light rail systems was 14%. It's craziness if we're going to spend all that money, and I don't believe that you're going to have the ridership. So the conclusions, and you're going to build light rail, you should be able to fill a bus every few minutes. If you can't, then maybe light rail is not the system that we should be building. And so this is based upon a recent May 2020 study from the Manhattan Institute, where they say that any corridor without enough ridership to fill a bus every few minutes, should not be a light rail line. And typical buses are about 40, 45 passengers. As you saw in previous slides, the average light rail is only carrying 25 people. And that's on the 10 most successful light rail lines in the country. So let's be judicious about our money, our tax money, and the amount of money that both the city and the state are going to spend. If we have the money, let's use it for other things, such as helping to reduce the fatalities in our city, in our country, in our state that are becoming really an epidemic. That's my presentation, and be happy to answer questions when the time is right. Robin, I will stop sharing my screen, and now we're back to everyone else.
Thank you very much, Wes. That was an informative and interesting presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we're going to hold all questions and comments until the conclusion of our three panelist presentations. So with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Al Barry, who is with AB Associates. Al's presentation is going to focus on the opportunity for a reimagined red line. Al, welcome, and if you would kindly begin by sharing a little bit about yourself and your background.
Thank you, Robin, and good morning, everybody. I think I probably know half of the people, at least in the room, and do not consider myself as much of a transportation expert as either our presenters or many of the people in the room. But I do have a long time interest in transportation back when I was at the city planning department as the assistant director and responsible for land development regulation, economic development strategies, and transportation from time to time. I also represented the city on the Baltimore Metropolitan Council in their transportation function. After I left the planning department, I started a private planning consulting practice focusing on land use regulation, although we've done about a dozen neighborhood master plans in the region. More importantly, I was involved and president of CPHA during the time when CPHA was there and had a committee on the region, also focusing in part on transportation. And I know many of the people on this call probably participated in that. So I bring a land use perspective and a planning perspective to this. And I appreciate Wes's comments because I think they're very well taken and that economics has to play some role. It's been stated numerous times and studied that fixed rail tends to have more impact on land use than bus transit. But these bus rapid transit systems, I don't know, and I would be interested in how much study has been done, whether that creates the same type of capital investment as fixed rail does over a long period of time. They're just starting, so we probably don't have any statistics on that. The premise of my argument today, and again, it started with an op-ed that I wrote, or a letter to the editor I wrote, praising the two Maryland senators for at least keeping a east-west, what's called the red line, in a potential now passed infrastructure bill. However, I made the point then in the Sun that that was not a pledge or a financial commitment, but it did offer an opportunity to basically rethink how much of the red line, or if the red line, or what kind of red line should be planned for. And I think the opportunity is there that because the red line now, as it was originally planned, has some flaws that I will get into. It wasn't solely that the governor decided without any reason the red line should go away. And it certainly, in my opinion, didn't address the need for east-west transit of some form. Parenthetically, I've heard recently, and people in the state can try to confirm this, that MDOT or the governor, whoever, has ordered or had ordered all of the consultant files and the engineering that went into the red line destroyed. I would like to have some confirmation if that's true or not, because if it's true, we may have a very long road ahead of us, no pun intended, as to restarting it and going through the whole process again. The other aspect I want to bring is at least my perceptions of some of the critical issues that perhaps influenced the decision at the state level, rightly or wrongly, to abandon the red line. I thought the excessive tunneling to downtown was always an issue, particularly near the water. The decision to shift the light rail line tunnel away from Inner Harbor East, which was a travesty and self-serving to protect a developer's interest. And that was a problem because it added over a year of engineering and basically put the decision into the then incoming Governor Hogan. I thought the planning for the red line that went through Canton at the edge of a high density catchment area as opposed to the middle of a catchment area was a planning mistake. West talks about density. You don't put you don't put rail that requires density at the edge of it. You put it in the middle of it if you can, tunnel or no tunnel. And then as West got into, I think the low ridership per mile per cost was something that compared to the Purple Line even represented arguments against having a red line go forward at all. However, now we have a new infrastructure bill. We have a new opportunity, and that infrastructure bill has two important elements that ought to be combined in the planning for a new east-west transit. And that involves obviously the placeholder that the senators put in, but also the highway to nowhere fixes, the dividing of highways and communities allows the east-west corridor to focus on the highway to nowhere. And the planning ought to be for both, and the funding ought to come from both. However, I don't have yet any indication that the city or the state, for that matter, has started any thinking proactively as to how to combine those. I realize the bill just passed, but many other cities, I believe, are ahead of us in terms of planning for these types of capital opportunities. And I hope the city and the state can move quickly along with the communities involved to begin to tap into that money. As an example of this, back when the original stimulus 10 or 12 years ago was put in, I convinced the city of Baltimore Transportation to apply for funding to hire RKK to basically look at what it would take to take down I-83. As many of you know, I've been arguing for that along with many other communities and people for a number of years. The city did hire a very reputable, obviously, consultant to provide a roadmap of the pros and cons of that. And that was funded with stimulus money. That same kind of money you would hope would be in this new infrastructure bill that the city and state can take advantage of. And that speaks to a larger question, which is, in my opinion, the lack of integration of planning for transportation between the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, the city of Baltimore, and the state. Some would argue that means we should have a regional planning authority, or at least a regional transportation authority. And I think Sam is going to be talking about that in his segment. But if I were going to start to reimagine the red line, I would do the easy shovel-ready part of it, essentially from the Social Security complex, but end the line at the Lexington Market Station, which provides, transfers to Metro and light rail and the rest of the region. That would be a relatively low cost, easy construction, and we should focus on the incremental aspects of the red line that can be done quickly. That would be the first step I would do. And again, combine it with the planning and funding for reconnecting communities on either side of the highway to nowhere. Another opportunity, which has been on the books for a number of years, has been called a mark-to-mark connection, which is creating a MARC station at Bayview, having a station, if possible, at EBDI, the other Hopkins campus, going to Penn Station, and then, of course, to the West Baltimore MARC station. That's a way of integrating more of the Baltimore region into the Washington area, which I think is critical to ultimately Baltimore's economic success. The last thing I would ask that some of you have brought up, I think has some merit and should have been studied when the North Avenue Rising plan was funded, was the idea of a trolley of some sort along, not a light rail particularly given the cost, but maybe a trolley system along North Avenue, east to west. That's a major corridor connecting a lot of communities that are transit dependent, as the North Avenue Rising study argued for. And I think that's an important part, again, of east-west transit connectivity. So with that, I would like to just finish and thank you for holding this. I look forward to hearing Sam's presentation. I think I know what he's going to say and argue for, but this is an important forum to at least interject ideas as to how the issues should move forward in some kind of planning function rather than just recreate the red line as it was originally proposed, because I think that's a fatal discussion and will waste everyone's time, frankly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Al. We appreciate both your time and your thoughts. We now would like to warmly welcome Samuel Jordan. Samuel is the president of the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition. His presentation is titled Restoring the Red Line, A Start Toward Equity in Baltimore. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you so much, Robin and Transit Choices friends. And of course, there are quite a few BTEC Nation members listening in today, but I do want to make sure that we have a full discussion as possible. And this will be, in fact, an ongoing discussion. But we certainly appreciate the opportunity to emphasize just what we at BTEC are proposing. First of all, we want to make certain that there are key questions, key principles understood from the beginning. First is, in making a decision about transit mode, we must ask first, what is the problem we're trying to resolve? I do believe that neither of the prior panelists will insist that any one transit mode will solve all transit needs. In this slide, you're seeing, of course, the red line alignment. 14.2 miles, 19 stations, 45 minutes from Hopkins Bayview to Woodlawn CMS, 54,000 riders per day. These are the key messages I want to leave with you and perhaps get a chance to elaborate upon them in the discussion, mine, as well as in the question and answer. First of all, BTEC pursues the red line because we're addressing the issue of structural racism in transportation policy and investment. Now, we did hear Wes speak about equity, and we talk about the importance of addressing the issue structural racism because it needs structural change, but we also have the opportunity to represent the decision by Governor Hogan as a measure of his allegiance to Baltimore's segregationist policy in transportation and in all matters, perhaps with public policy. But nevertheless, we're speaking of the major impact on the region, improved transit equity, and we want to address the issue of the need to bury the autocentric culture. In addition to these issues, we want to make certain that it's understood what red line brings to Baltimore: 10,000 jobs, dramatically reduced commute times.
Morning.
$3 to $6.5 billion in $3 to $6.5 billion in transit-oriented development. And we want to make certain that Baltimore has, for this future, a vision that is supported by the transportation and transit mode. We want to insist that there is no real competition between BRT, LRT. It's an artificial competition. We'll speak about that. BTEC also advocates for a Baltimore Regional Transportation Authority. And we'll discuss our reasons for that: to secure autonomy and accountability in the decision-making authority, and to have flexibility in funding strategies for the combined jurisdictions of the region for the very first time. BTEC also envisions a long-needed anchoring east-west spine to create a system which would be the first installment of an equitable, reliable transit network for the region. And this is a role that only light rail can fill. Again, we'll discuss BRT, bus rapid transit versus light rail transit, but only to indicate that this is an ongoing discussion, but it's promoted by those who want to insist that cost is the most important factor in determining the future for Baltimore and the transit mode that we choose. I also want to emphasize that the transit equity movement is also an environmental protection movement. And of course, one of the most important principles in all human endeavor, build the foundation first. Our vision for Baltimore means that we see not only Baltimore becoming a leading city in this nation, offering an equitable, reliable, multimodal transportation system, but it also, Baltimore will become a livable, walkable, breathable, workable place to live. Now, I want to go back to let you know just a few things about my advocacy and what we've done in the past with respect to building this future for Baltimore. For years, 9 in fact, as a volunteer planner on the Red Line project, I visited cities all over the nation, including those with heralded transportation systems, Portland, Seattle, Denver, even Charlotte, Boston, most recently Phoenix and Austin, where choices have been made about the futures of the city, the long term, not the short term. And in the long term choices they've made, they have public transportation systems anchored by light rail. But multimodal, there is a place for bus rapid transit. Bus rapid transit is frankly an ancillary, supplemental, stopgap system. Even in the places that West has heralded, bus rapid transit follows prior development, in fact, prior rail development, urban rail, light rail, including the heavy rail as in the DC Metro rail system. But with respect to our opening in terms of a presentation, an important factor of my own experience that we share with BTEC is to discover the role that communities play in deciding the future of the city and the region. In the planning for the Baltimore Red Line, hundreds of community leaders, members, along with agency staff, consultants, worked 13 years to leave the Baltimore Red Line fully funded, fully approved, and in possession of the Holy Grail in transit planning, the record of decision. That's the federal government's signal that you can begin to spend our $900 million grant. Governor Hogan, in his claim to be concerned about cost, threw away the investment. And we want to make certain that we have not, and make it clear, that in our discussions in the previous panelists, Wes Guckert and Al Barry, we haven't heard this discussion about what do we want from our transportation system, and why is there an important difference between concerns about cost and concerns and issues about investment. In this issue, in this discussion, we want to make certain that the discussion of investments speaks to the kind of life and future for all Baltimoreans. BRT, the Bus Rapid Transit System, with its features, with its record in this nation, fails to deliver on key elements needed by Baltimore. Our plan and suggestions for BTEC is not to simply prepare and provide for mobility only, movement from point A to point B. Baltimore also needs greatly improved transit equity, and it also needs the transformative economic power that only light rail brings. In fact, I would challenge Wes Guckert and Al Berry to tell me that they found a development project that was really most recommended. They were excited by it because it was near a bus stop, near a bus line. They can answer that in the question and answer period. I also want to introduce this fact that an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Emergency Committee on the Transportation Crisis, the ECTC, was in fact the most important element in the creation of the Washington, D.C. WMATA, that's the Washington Area Metropolitan Transit Administration, the DC Metro Rail System, ECTC, the Emergency Committee on the Transportation Crisis, insisted that the Eisenhower era monies for the Interstate Highway Program not be spent on highways in Washington, D.C. Like the Highway to Nowhere in Baltimore, the plan was to cross the city of Washington with highways, 6 and 8 lane highways that would destroy communities, particularly Black and brown communities, as did happen with that stub of a ditch we call the Highway to Nowhere. The importance of the ECTC is that BTEC, we haven't heard this from the prior panelists, insists that the interests of the communities in Baltimore, members and leaders of the community in Baltimore and Baltimore region, are represented in their needs, our needs, for the city and the region in building out a transportation system. So now with the discussion, I want to emphasize first that these are issues. BTEC has entered a comparative and, excuse me, a cooperative project with Johns Hopkins School, Bloomberg School of Public Health. In fact, that project resulted in Baltimore's first transit equity analysis. We overlaid maps, transit equity, social vulnerability, health, and pollution. And what we found were these 6 areas you see on your screen. They were in most need of investments in transit, not only in health and the reduction of pollution generated by the transportation sector. Completing the red line is an important measure, an important element of addressing these issues of transit equity, the lack of transit access, the lack of access to destinations, and the harmful impacts of the emissions generated by the transportation sector. We'll speak to this issue further in our discussion and hopefully in the question and answer period. But this is part of the reason we insist upon building a red line light rail system. It answers more than one question. Wes and Al have not addressed the multiple questions that must be answered in the future for Baltimore when it chooses a transportation system, not just movement from point A to point B. The massive economic development generated by light rail over the past 6 decades. Light rail has been the most robust generator of economic development in this country, no competition. In fact, if we were asked anyone on the panel, the difference between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore over the last, since 1976, has been the DC Metro Rail System as part of WMATA, which is a multimodal network, but anchored by rail. Rail provides the anchoring spine for the system. There are BRT, bus rapid transit elements, but they are all, the bus rapid transit elements are all supportive, ancillary, and supplemental to the rail line. This is what we understand about the future for Baltimore. And one of our key, yes.
Sam, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We've been messaging you in the chat. We have not been able to see your screen.
Okay.
Now,
permit
what
me
we
to
can
do this.
do, because, we know you want to continue with your presentation, is
Yes.
perhaps at the conclusion, you'll be able to send me a link to the presentation, and I will share that along with the recording to all meeting participants.
Why don't we try this, Robin? With the indulgence of the panelists and the others, let me share my screen. Let's try that. Where are we? Are you permitting me now to share my screen? Here we are.
I am. Unfortunately, we're not able to see it. Oh.
Okay,
let's see.
we're getting there.
Yes, we now see it. Thank you.
We're still getting there.
Yes.
Okay, let me make certain I adjust properly. You're only seeing part of it, is that correct?
Right now we are seeing a slide that says areas in highest need.
Okay, you're seeing now areas in highest need?
Correct. Now we have key messages, red, yes. And this is the beginning, red line alignment.
Right, okay. Let me do this, and I'll try to accelerate, take a little less time. How much time am I left with, Robin?
We have you with 1, 2, 3, 4 more minutes.
4 more minutes?
Yes.
Then we'll rush through the slides. But you can see it now on the screen, is that correct?
Yes, we can.
Okay, this first slide then, key messages, and that's important. First, what is the problem we're trying to solve? We want to solve questions of transit equity. We want to solve questions of the transformative economic development that only light rail brings. And we want to address the issue of burying the autocentric culture. Among our key messages as well, we're addressing the issue of structural racism in transportation policy and investment. And for that reason, we're making structural change where we've found structural racism in our advocacy for Baltimore Regional Transportation Authority. We're very much interested in the fact that light rail, the red line, brings $3 to $6.5 billion in economic development to Baltimore's region, to the benefit of all of its residents. We know that even with its problems, the purple line has attracted $12 billion in commitments along its 15-mile corridor. But 10,000 jobs, dramatically reduced commute times, and the transit-oriented development is a gift from the red line that cannot be replicated by a bus rapid transit system. We're also insisting that a transit equity movement is an environmental protection movement. And then one of the key elements in human endeavors is always build the foundation first. Whatever we learn, and I can express in this presentation, is that light rail is an anchoring spine in our projection for the build out of an equitable, reliable, multimodal transportation system for the Baltimore region. And in that vision, Baltimore, not only along its red line corridor with its 19 stations, a village concept within 15 minutes of a transit hub, livable, walkable, breathable, workable areas. This slide that you did not see earlier were the 6 areas that our study project with Johns Hopkins identified as those most in need. You'll see that they're along the red line corridor, where we have benefits not only in development, community stabilizing economic development, but also where we know that we need to address the matter of public health, the emissions from the transportation sector that have contributed to, in fact, exacerbation of COVID-19 in Baltimore. And in increasing the speed through the slides, this is a reference to a report commanded by the 2018 legislative session to MDOT-MTA to write a report on just what would be the steps in reviving the Red Line Light Rail project. We want to talk about it further in our discussion, question and answer period, because it doesn't answer the question. In fact, it makes conclusions of this type, that given the scarcity of funding and FTA's likely interest in geographic diversity, a second grant to Maryland is doubtful in the next 20 to 25 years. At that time, this report was written, Maryland already had 2 grants, $900 million. The Baltimore Regional Transportation Authority, we certainly will discuss further, but also Mr. Guckert's principles, 1 transit stop, 1 to 2 mile intervals. Baltimore is 9 miles long, 9 miles wide. High density, 20 to 25 density units. He insists that the Baltimore is 10 units per acre. There were 12 units per acre in his article in the Baltimore Business Journal. But Washington, D.C. has 16 people per acre. Are we suggesting that Washington, D.C.'s rail program has been a failure because it doesn't meet Guckert's 47 persons per acre requirement? And there is no such requirement, by the way. This is a discussion about his wildly successful Cleveland experiment. Not only did it begin, it was installed in 2008, but it was planned as a light rail track. It was a light rail planning for the Health Line that attracted the transit-oriented development. As with the Purple Line, those commitments, that $12 billion commitment along the Purple Line, these commitments were made years before, obviously, years before groundbreaking. But in Cleveland, what we've seen now is that Health Line, which is a bus rapid transit line, after an experience that we had a governor who decided not to build the Red Line, just as in Cleveland, a new mayor decided not to build the rail along the Health Line and built a bus rapid transit system. And by 2010, it began experiencing dramatic delays in service. This is a schedule that we'll talk about later, but this is the route was developed for a 28-minute course from end to end. It averages now 40 minutes. It achieves that 28-minute goal only about 3:00 a.m. So in keeping the bus rapid rules here from Mr. Guckert, said transit stops in 1 to 2 miles. This was in his publication, November 2015, not long after the cancellation of the Red Line. Baltimore is only 9 miles wide. High density transit stops, we've already discussed. Dedicated lanes in the median, that's impossible in downtown Baltimore. That's why there must be a tunnel. In fact, he urges the dedicated lanes in the median, and that is, again, not possible in Baltimore. Traffic signal priority, we haven't figured that out yet. Robin, I'm going to bring my presentation to a close with these discussions, that now we have the political conditions that favor restoring the Red Line. Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding that several of the 2 speakers have mentioned, but with a twist. We insist that our mayor, Mayor Scott, take the lead in expressing a commitment to building the Red Line, a commitment to creating a Baltimore Regional Transportation Authority in order to give the region itself greater autonomy in public policy, in transit policy making, and in flexible strategies for funding. We want to focus on the equity and environmental justice that now is a trademark of the Biden administration. We want to bring that to fruition in Baltimore, and we want to apply for those funds. With the mayor's commitment, we can now begin to follow up the work that's been done by our congressional delegation, particularly Senators Cardin and Van Hollen. Our congressional delegation and locally elected officials are supportive, and now Baltimore can get the second chance with the completed Red Line to be a walkable, livable, breathable, workable city. And we want you to join us in reviving the Red Line to invest in Baltimore's future. That image is from our petitioning for the Baltimore Regional Transportation Authority at 32nd Street Market. We do that 32nd Street Market, the JFX Market, and elsewhere around the city. Thank you so much. And this last slide is a slide that repeats the key messages. And I think the most important will be always build the foundation first. The bus rapid transit system is not the anchoring spine needed for a public transportation system. In fact, no leading city in this nation has a public transportation system anchored by a bus. I'll end there, Robert, and thank you. And perhaps we'll have a fuller discussion in the question and answer period.
Sam, thank you so much. If you would kindly just close your presentation, remove it from the screen, that would be wonderful. So we are now moving into the sort of Q&A portion of our meeting. But what I would like to do is to allocate a few minutes to both Wes and Al Berry, if they would like to respond to any key points of Sam's presentation.
This is Wes. This is Wes. I'll go first. I'm not sure Al's there. First,
Here,
Sam,
here.
I think you made a excellent presentation with really great points, without a doubt. I love the fact that you took time to examine and do counterpoint to some of my stuff. I think it continues to be important that we understand that the city of Baltimore has significant economic issues that need to be dealt with. I'm just simply urging that the city give clear consideration. This isn't federal money. This isn't just city money, it's taxpayer money. And we need to be certain that we're spending those tax dollars in the right place at the right time. But overall, Sam, I think you've got an excellent presentation with excellent counterpoints to the ones that I made. And I've never suggested that we not build tunnels, although Al's concerned about that. If tunnels is part of the transit line, so be it. I'm not against that, but you can also build BRT in tunnels as a first step. I understand the fact, Sam, that you're concerned that BRT gets built. At least I think that's what I heard or read, that BRT gets built, we'll never get to LRT. And I understand that comment as well. Al Berry, do you want to say anything?
Yes, thank you both for excellent points made. I think Sam's map showing transit inequity that Hopkins, I guess, produced illustrates one of the issues that I had with the Red Line going through Canton, frankly. And all I was arguing for is that we don't take an all or nothing approach, that we think about this incrementally, think about what can be done in phases and quickly and in a cost-effective way, combining the highway to nowhere funding as well as this new transit funding, hopefully Baltimore can compete for. I'm interested in more planning for a reexamination and not speaking against light rail or not speaking against bus rapid transit. The city can have a variety and needs a variety of transit options for people, even to get from the stops that any of these stations, 1 or 2 miles apart, would need to get to the last mile jobs, whether it's Dundalk or the Amazon centers in the lower part of Highlandtown, Clinton Street, that area. So I'm look forward to the questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Wes and Al, for your commentary. What I'd like to do, because there are so many questions and comments in the chat, is that I'd like to sort of go in order of the comments that I'm seeing. I would also respectfully ask, in the interest of time, if you would kindly keep to the questions and comments that you're making, and obviously address it to the person to whom you would like to respond. I'd like to begin with Jimmy Rouse.
Hey, when I bring up time with people, I hear three mentioned. I would assist to Wes and Sam and Al, anybody who would like to have a comment. The first problem is the reinstatement of environmental approval. And I'm curious whether that would apply equally to bus rapid transit and or light rail. If Wes and Sam could answer that. The second issue is the replacement of federal and state funding. As you know, funding for the Red Line was $2 billion from the state and $1 billion from the Fed. Do you see that as changing in this present environment? And how will we go about replacing the state $2 billion? And also, in line with that, people are telling me that there will be a significant cost escalation if we went about trying to rebuild the Red Line as initially formulated. So I'm just interested in hearing y'all's reaction to that.
Yeah, I'll try first, Jimmy, and thank you for your questions. In fact, I want to thank, or at least show some appreciation to our other panelists, Barry and Guckert, that they do accept the fact that my presentation, with its problems with the slides and so on, does center the issue that we must address. And when Wes says he thanks me for my counterpoints to the points that he made, because they're valid. One is the key issues, Jimmy, before I talk to this question about the funding. What issue are we trying to resolve? That's first. Bus rapid transit systems, and this is a false petition or competition and false tension. You hear it all the time, but it's because it's part of an act to promote cost as the most important factor in deciding what we should do. And I can tell you that when you take that approach, the cheapest approach, you get the cheapest results. We didn't talk about and go into any detail about the fact that the vehicles in bus rapid transit systems last only from 6 maybe to 10 years. They take a beating. The roads take a beating. So by the time, for example, the life durability of a rail car is about 40, in some places 50 years, but let's say 40 years. During that period, you will have replaced or had to replace the vehicles in a bus rapid transit system 3 or 4 times. That overcomes what might have been the initial advantage in the startup cost. But nevertheless, we talked about Cleveland just for a moment. West is wildly successful, but that was based on what he was discussing as its attraction of development in Cleveland along the health line. Even the health line hospitals now are still angry by the fact that what they had planned as a rail system has become a bus system, and the bus system is experiencing great failures. Beginning is loss of ridership and delays in 2010, as I mentioned, a 28-minute ride becoming a 40-minute ride on average. Also has lost 25% of its ridership from pre-COVID 2018. And we understand what that issue is with ridership. We face it here in Baltimore. And BTEC's approach is, if you want to improve the ridership, you have to improve the experience of the people already using it. Now directly to Jimmy's comment about funding first. The state, in the first iteration, because of the increase in the gas tax on the O'Malley administration, the State Transportation Fund had $1.3 billion to contribute to the Red Line light rail system. Baltimore, $200 million. Baltimore County, about $60 million. Private sector, about 30 to 40. But that was the way the $2.95 billion was assembled, making it eligible for the record of decision, the $900 million in this, what was then called the New Starts Grant. So we assemble the money. And that's important when we speak of cost. Now, when we speak of the cancellation of the red line, there's something I want to put in the discussion that we haven't addressed. That is this constant claim that the red line itself was a wasteful expense. In fact, the governor called it a boondoggle. There is no study, no report, no analysis that corroborates that claim. In fact, as I discussed with the response to the idea of bus rapid transit, through the median, downtown Baltimore, that's why you have to have a tunnel. One, to assure the reliability, but there's no way you can get a bus rapid transit system on the media through the 3.4 mile system of the red line under downtown Baltimore. And of course, the red line does in fact traverse the median 40, then up Edmondson Avenue on its way out to Woodlawn. So we've got that covered, Wes. We've got that covered, Al. Now, the money, the funds that Senators Cardin and Van Hollen got at least reference in the infrastructure bill, that's the start of a flow of funds to Baltimore to complete the red line, because the red line is a high priority project for the Biden administration. It was shovel ready when Governor Hogan was elected, and the Trump administration shut down our complaint. We were the first of two Title VI administrative complaints against the governor in the state to address this question. This was the governor's most important and best moment to explain why he shut down the red line, and he never did, and there's been no explanation since. So there's no proof about this expense to the red line. It's Hogan's big lie, just as if you were insisting that the 2020 elections were fraudulent. It's a big lie and it's repeated, but without evidence. So this stream of funds, one, it depends on the commitment from the region. That's why we want Mayor Brandon Scott, who's a transit advocate, transit supporter, to lead this commitment early. The advice from the senators, particularly Senator Cardin, was we've got to show support for it at the regional level and the city level. And with that support, we can make and help make that funding flow from the Biden administration manifest real in Baltimore to begin the completion of the light rail system. With the Baltimore Regional Transportation Authority and its first and highest priority completion of the red line, because it's beneficial to the entire region. That's why we advocate for it. So we see the pieces coming together, but also with the important element, support from the communities in Baltimore. That's why we're petitioning. That's why we're on the streets, where you can see us in Baltimore, at the markets as well. So the funds will follow the commitment. The Biden administration is committed. Mayor Scott can lead the commitment of Baltimore City and, as a result, the region. But Johnny O, Pittman, Calvin Ball, Evans, the executives in the region are also interested in rail projects and also interested in build out of a network in Baltimore region comparable to WMATA. And that's what we foresee. A Baltimore Regional Transportation Authority that addresses these issues of the funding as well.
Thank you, Sam. I'd like to give a brief opportunity for Wes or Al to respond to Jimmy's questions before I go into the chat room.
I don't have anything to add. I think the question of funding and the cost increase from the $3 billion is probably unquestioned at this point. And that's why I suggested doing a portion of the red line that would be the least expensive and the most quickly to implement as a starting point.
And I don't have any further comments either. I know that there are some excellent thoughts that are in the chat room, and some are quite long, some are quite short. But the folks that I think are important to listen to now to address are those that have taken their time to to be here this morning and to provide their own comments, because the comments and suggestions are not things just from Sam or Wes and Al. There are a lot of smart people that are taking their time to listen to us. And I think, quite frankly, Robin, I'd like to have that discussion with the rest of the folks.
Yes, I agree, and it's perfect timing. I would like to begin with Scott Spencer.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Scott Spencer with Ameristar Rail. You can find out a little bit more about what we're doing on our website, ameristarrail.com, but we're a private sector entity that's committed to improve Amtrak's Northeast Corridor service and the importance of connecting transit in all those cities that are served. Just a brief comment about the value, as Samuel has discussed, about transit, particularly light rail or heavy rail, generating development, which creates jobs and opportunities in communities. I've been a consultant for over 40 years in the rail industry, and most rail projects, light rail or heavy rail, you will find that in a 5 to 10 year period, they generally generate a multiple of 4 to 5 times the project costs in associated development and economic activity. So the issue is BRT certainly has a very important role to feed the spine lines of rail lines that are built. But ultimately, the backbone of economic development is built around the success of rail. And I'll give you one project. In the 90s, I was responsible for developing the startup and operating plan for Hudson Bergen Light Rail Transit, which is on the New Jersey side, connecting Bayonne, Jersey City, Hoboken. And we were criticized much in the press and by politicians that it was at that time, it was $1 billion project for 20 miles of light rail as a $1 billion boondoggle. Yet once the construction started in the 90s, development started to come into Jersey City and Hoboken, and now they consider it the Gold Coast. And within 5 years, $5 billion of development, last count, had been generated. So there's a terrific opportunity. I just wanted to mention briefly what we're going to be announcing publicly. We've got a lot of details moving on this, so we won't get the details out until hopefully before the holidays, but we've been in contact with Mayor Scott's team. There's a really interesting inflection point in history for Baltimore right now, because if you know the Northeast Corridor, the Baltimore tunnels are past their useful life, having been built shortly after the Civil War. Amtrak has a commitment of $4 billion to replace what's called the B&B tunnels, the tunnels west of the Baltimore station. But just east of the Baltimore station, the Union tunnels are just as old and just as poor condition, and they have to be replaced at billions of dollars of cost. So what Ameristar Rail is proposing, let's leverage this required investment to provide a more expansive, as BTEC has been talking about, transit equity benefits for the whole community beyond just those who can afford to ride the Northeast Corridor. So we're actually developing a proposal which we call the Baltimore Crosstown Rail Tunnel that will replace this Northeast Corridor tunnel with a 4-track tunnel right through the heart of Baltimore that would put the Amtrak station down at the Inner Harbor. But because it's 4 tracks, 2 of the 4 tracks could be operated as a Baltimore Crosstown Metro and also be used by MARC trains. And I can tell you when we have more time, perhaps at a future opportunity, when we make this announcement public, I can go over it with the maps. But what's remarkable about the spine line of bringing this Northeast Corridor investment home for Baltimore and building on the back of it a crosstown metro, it creates a large amount of what the red line is trying to achieve in east-west transit. And it actually connects 7 of the 10 largest employers in Baltimore. And our preliminary calculations is it would generate upwards of $40 billion in residential, retail, and commercial development along this network. So I just want to give you an overview that we're looking at the required investments to replace the Baltimore tunnels and leverage that to put the station where it really belongs and put on the back of that a crosstown metro for Baltimore. And I look forward to giving you more details when we make the formal announcements later this year.
Thank you very much, Scott. We look forward
You're welcome.
to it.
Thank you for the time
I'd
this
like
morning.
to ask Jonathan Sachs to share his comments, questions.
Sure. Hey, thanks for the presentations to all the folks. I really enjoyed it. Just had a couple of questions for Mr. Guckert. I'm trying to understand how we use BRT to get from the west side to the east side through the city when as Mr. Jordan mentioned, you can't really have dedicated lanes. The traffic signal priority, which is one of the key R's in Mr. Guckert's rapid his rules for keeping the rapid in BRT. The transit signal priority hasn't been figured out for the north-south light rail yet, and we've had decades to figure that out. How are we going to figure it out for buses going through the city? So if we don't have dedicated lanes and we don't have we don't have traffic signal priority, and we have to have more stops than just one every mile or two. The city's only 9 miles wide. So, I mean, how do we make bus rapid transit work in downtown? And if we can't make bus rapid transit work in downtown when it's coming from west to east, then, I mean, you have to dig a tunnel, right? And so if we're going to dig a tunnel, isn't that the main cost vector that everyone's complaining about with light rail or even with metro going through the city? So that would be my question, is how do you reconcile the rules for bus rapid transit with what we can actually do in downtown Baltimore?
Thank you, Jonathan. They really are guidelines, not rules, number one. Number two, as I said earlier as part of Sam and Al's presentation, I'm not suggesting that you don't build the tunnels. What I am suggesting is that you can build the system that is currently being proposed, the way it's being proposed for light rail, but to start putting rubber tired vehicles on it versus putting in the rails, paying for that infrastructure to see if indeed there's enough ridership. Now Samuel argues, and I'm not going to dispute, but his argument is that without light rail, you will not have the amount of economic investment along the line. I'm not convinced that's the case. And as it relates to traffic signal priorities, the fact that the city can't get it right doesn't mean that the rest of the world doesn't get it right, because indeed they do. So traffic signal prioritization, quite frankly, works, and it works all over the world, all over the United States. The fact that Baltimore City government cannot get it right, I can't answer that, Jonathan, why they can't get it right, because indeed it does work.
So can I just say about traffic signal priority, most of the examples.
Please briefly, Jonathan.
Sure. Most of those examples that you're pointing to are suburban, where it's much easier to figure out traffic signal priority than it would be in a downtown Baltimore type of setting.
Thank you.
I had two comments just quickly. One, the state's trying to have these bus lanes throughout downtown Baltimore. Somebody ought to be testing that to see if they're actually working, what they're saving. Number one. And second, there is a east-west tunnel that was built for the metro line. And for some reason, the state decided not to use it and to move it down to the harbor, making it 2 blocks, another bad connection to the metro line, just to try to get a vanity project into the inner harbor. Use the existing one that was there. or have transfers. If I stop the light rail at the Lexington Market Station, you're right at two light rail station, you're at the metro station. And people can transfer to Hopkins Hospital. That's a good east-west connection. Not the only one you need, but it's one of them.
Can I answer that comment?
Thank you.
Robin?
Sam, I'm so sorry. We've got so many questions. I've got to move on. And what I will do is I will share the chat with each of our panelists, and you will have an opportunity to respond at that time. I'd like to ask Jonathan Sussman if he'd like to ask his question.
Sure. I think the one question that I had was for the first presenter in terms of the time period, looking at the light rail utilization numbers. What was that time period?
As I recall, that the time period that the Manhattan Institute studied, and it's on my slide, was a 7 or 8 year time period in the first part, like 2010 to 2017, as I recall. But it's on my slide. I have to go back and get that.
Okay, thank you.
Art Cohen. Is Art still with us?
So I basically just don't see why it's necessarily a choice between light rail and BRT. We can do both in a robust system. That's all.
I'm sorry, I missed that question. Robin, was that for me?
Yeah,
I think it was a comment. I think it was a comment. You can do both.
Comment, really. It's just a comment. That's all.
Okay.
The idea is to have a system and not just to have a project.
That's it.
I'm sorry, I'm having a problem with audio. Art, are you still speaking?
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Please continue.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very faintly.
Well, all I was saying was that it's a question of a system. It's not an either or between light rail and bus rapid transit. You can have both.
Everyone, I'm so sorry. I'm having some audio issues. I think that it would make sense, we're close to 3 minutes to concluding the meeting, to end here. I would like to especially thank our 3 wonderful guest panelists, Wes Guckert, Al Barry, and Samuel Jordan, for their very relevant, thoughtful, and insightful presentations and commentary. This is certainly an ongoing topic for discussion, which we will resume in 2022 with respect to any new information and updates. But until then, most of all, we thank each of you for sharing part of your morning with us today. We so appreciate your ongoing support of our mission. We wish you and yours a very happy Thanksgiving holiday, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Rob.
you. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
Thank you, friends who were participants in the
Yes, thank you, Sam.
certainly.
Bye-bye.
We'll talk.